Even Jefferson says you had to have the education part. He didn't say like the ignorant masses should leave the country, you know. But he is a strong believer in the potential or the perfectibility of man, as he called it. All right, so let's go back and review a little bit of this fairly quickly, and then you know, I'll add on to some stuff. Now, some of this is going to sound like government class, but that's okay. We're doing the beginning of our country, so that's kind of governmental, right? We call this the Federalist era because the president of the period, the two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, embodied a Federalist attitude. Got it? They were not, either one of them, though, Federalist politicians. Everybody hear that? Both Washington and Adams would refuse to be named a party. Now, later, Adams would be the nominee for the Federalist Party, okay, this thing called a party. George Washington will be an independent president. He had no partisan affiliation at all. So we're going to get to the fact that really the dominant figure in Federalist ideas is Alexander Hamilton, right? Washington is going to take lots of advice from Hamilton, and that's important when we read over him. So we talked about this period. It's a period, you know, where the statues are built, kind of thing. We talked about who Washington was. I again want to point out this picture. I went and did some more research on this picture because I remember grabbing it before. This is a lithograph, by the way. That's like a colorized drawing, you know, that's been remade. And it was printed in France for distribution in 1853. So if you think about what we know about Washington, he was a sort of mythical figure. And so when they depict slavery at Mount Vernon, it's depicted in a very sort of pastoral, happy, you know, state. Keep in mind, in the 1850s, our country was about to tear itself apart, primarily over the issue of slavery. So this was meant to be sort of like, oh, it's a wonderful relationship. Look, even George Washington worked, and it's called Washington the Farmer, right? I think, again, this is complete propaganda, you know, just like that drawing from the 1850s. All right, I'm pointing at Washington crossing the Delaware. Not to say that there was not wonderful aspects of George Washington, but there is no doubt that he was a slave owner who paid people to capture runaway slaves, for example. Okay, so that's an element of who he is, and it shouldn't be ignored. Now, your book is going to go into three sort of existential, I use that word in my AP government class, to describe threats facing our country, right? Threats that could, in reality, put America into a failed state if we don't solve these, all right? Now, the first is the fact that we owed, in today's money, $900 billion. Now, again, today's money, we owe $26 trillion. All right, you know, so this will be a very small debt in comparison to where we are now. But at the time, a debt of $75 million was 30% of GDP, which was a sizable amount. Today, we're looking at about 120% of GDP in our annual deficit. So much worse now than we were in 1789. But you know, they're starting out. We've got the world's largest GDP by a it's like 7 trillion more than the Chinese. I think our GDP currently is like 21 trillion dollars, right? Pretty freaking good. Okay. Number two, this event of the French Revolution is going to dominate every president from Washington to James Madison. Okay, the French Revolution starts in 1789. What year does Washington take office? 1789, right? The Reign of Terror is in 1793, right when his re-election occurred. Okay, 93, 94. Napoleon takes office, so to speak, in 99. Okay, during John Adams' presidency, and he is not overthrown until James Madison's presidency. So basically, the Napoleonic Wars or the French Revolution are going to be an existential threat because the French and the British are going to either see you as on our side or against us. And where do we want to be in this problem? Neither, right? We want to be like hands off, and we're trying to start a country. All right, but that's going to create real problems. Thirdly, is this mention that I've already made before. Whenever our people find something they don't like politically, what have they done historically up and down? They revolted somehow, right? So this brand new government has been created. It is trying to be a centralized authority, right? And the concern is, if they're not happy, what are they going to do? And this is foreshadowing what other event that you now know about from yesterday. Very good, Chris. Whiskey Rebellion, right. In other words, they're going to go to that playbook again, only has the game changed. Because Washington very different than the absence of a president, right? Yeah. And so if you're thinking on the future, well, we'll get to that. So lots and lots of distrust of the central authority, and we've created a government based on that. Okay? Got these three? Good. All right. Now, I asked you a couple questions about geographic changes. So first of all, what was America overwhelmingly descriptive-wise during this period? What kind of people were we mostly? Well, we're definitely farmers. So if you're a farmer, where do you live? Rural. All right. So America in 1789 looked like here, more or less. You know, not very obviously much smaller. Danville's got about 50,000 people. So did Philadelphia at the time. You know, it was the biggest city in America. So the point is that rural farming communities, 90% of the country, right? But you also have taking place during the presidency of George Washington 3 states that will join the Union. All right, and a 4th state will be added not long after. So Vermont already kind of was up there. If you see up here, they had been called the Republic of Vermont briefly. And then they're like, well, that's probably not going to work out. And so they became a state in New England. But where are the next states? In the Western territory that we've acquired, right? Either Kentucky and Tennessee in the Southwest, right? Or Ohio in the Northwest territory, right? That's the first out of the Northwest Ordinance. Remember this thing? So Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. And it kind of makes sense. What was the most populous state prior to those 3? Virginia. And all 3 of these states are settled by Virginians. All 3, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. So if you're in the southern part of Ohio, they call it the butternut region to this day. And it's because the southern part of my good friend saw the Florida-based kind of classic rock band Leonard Skinner for the first time in Ohio. All right. And he said there were more Confederate flags flying there than there ever been around here, he thought. Yeah. In other words, very, very similar here in southern Ohio to right across the river. Places like Louisville. Okay. So this area here is going to add to the Union during this period. Got it? Okay, so I asked you about GW. What's unique about him in history from yesterday? What's unique? He's the only president that's ever happened to. Every elector voted for him. Now remember, they're not running for office, right? So these electors are choosing, you know, so you had votes. This is where people have, what did people vote for, right? Well, what did you vote for? You voted for electors, right? And then the electors voted for who they thought should be president. So all the electors voted for who on their first ballot? And then 43 of them, I think it was, 44, voted for John Adams on their second. Okay, and then everybody else was like distant third. So again, what did John Adams become? Vice president. Only one job, what is it? Well, that's technically not a job, although that's true. You know, you're not standing around on deck. But he actually had until after Jefferson and Madison a specific kind of job. He would sit at a dais, a table that's elevated, and do what? He presided over the Senate. He was the presiding officer of the Senate. Still is, technically. So if, for whatever reason, the nomination for Judge Barrett became tied, 50-50, what could Vice President Pence do? He could make the tie-breaking vote, which has happened before in history, where the Vice President has cast a tie-breaking vote to decide the outcome of an election, or not an election, but a decision, not necessarily justice. But you understand? So that's still the only official role of the only official duty of the Vice President. Of course, in the last 50 years, the vice presidency has been expanded kind of dramatically. You know, if you think about the active role that Vice President Pence plays to reach out to, well, he's the head of the COVID task force. That's one thing he's in charge of, among others. So, in other words, today the VP is very much part of what's called the president's cabinet, but he wasn't back then. Now, this is not meant to be trivia. It is an interesting thing. So initially, the government of the United States under the Articles was meeting where? In New York, the last 5 years of it, okay? Keep in mind, the Continental Congress had moved around like 7 times because who was pursuing them everywhere? The British. So, you know, at one point, Trenton, New Jersey was our national capital. At one point, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was our national capital because it was where who was located? Continental Congress, right? The Congress was there, and that's why it was the capital. Well, this is where the Congress kind of ended up, right? And so for the first 2 years of American history, this was our capital, New York, all right? And so this is President Washington's statue. This is where he swears the first oath of office, right, ever. Today, by the way, does anybody either here or online know what is, like when I'm standing at this spot looking at this picture, there's a building immediately behind me to my left, like it's at 7 o'clock. What building is immediately behind, like in front of this building, diagonal to it? Anybody know? Anybody ever been here? It's a really narrow, like thoroughfare right here. Nobody online knows? Yeah, very good. Say it louder. The New York Stock Exchange. This is Wall Street, like where the picture is taken from. I'm standing on Wall Street looking at it, kind of thing, right? So can anybody guess why maybe this isn't the best place to have the national capital? The founders knew that in London, the headquarters of government and the headquarters of commerce were located. In Paris, the headquarters of finance and the headquarters of government, by and large, at Versailles as well. What they were very concerned about is if you put the national capital where the nation's banking and finance interests are, what could very well happen to the government? I mean, maybe, but that wouldn't be my conclusion. That it could have an undue influence on them, right? Like all these rich people are right across the block because they influence how the government works out. So they literally situated New York away ultimately to Washington, D.C., and there's been a rivalry there ever since. You understand? Like which city is cooler or whatever. New York way cooler, but you know, I like Washington, okay? But nonetheless, George Washington was here for about 1.5 years. Then they moved here. This movement is back to where they kind of started. Where is this place? This is Philadelphia, right? But it's during this period of movement that they had agreed to the act called the Residence Act. The Residence Act allowed this to be the capital for 10 years, okay? And then where? The District of Columbia, right, named after our first president. So Washington, D.C. will be being built during 1790 to 1800, okay? John Adams will be the first resident of the White House, but it is unfinished. Jefferson will be the first resident of a completed White House, okay? So they're building this down on a swamp on the Potomac River about 30 miles away from Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. They're building the capital that we know, okay? Not this, but the national capital. Now, we talked about the first cabinet. Keep in mind, not in the Constitution, not official, but the heads of the various state legislative departments, not legislative, but bureaucratic agencies, that's what I'm trying to say. Don't forget, the first one is Jefferson at what department? Forgotten already?
State.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm staring at you guys like, answer me, please. Yeah, state. What is State Department?
Foreign policy.
Foreign affairs, foreign relations. So diplomats, ambassadors, our relationships with other countries. Does anybody know who our current Secretary of State is?
Mike Pompeo.
Very good. Good job, Nicholas. Mike Pompeo. That's exactly right. Who, you know, has been in that office for about 2 years. No, not even that long. We got a couple. I forget when he came in last. But nonetheless, Jefferson State. What's Treasury? Okay, yeah, Alexander Hamilton. And what is Treasury? Like, what is that? All right, so broadly, it's the national economy. Okay, it involves things like currency, it involves things like banking. Keep in mind, what we're used to today, they had no idea of, and that's like what rules and regulations. So this wasn't an idea of regulating banking. It was the idea of like how to make the government operate, financially. All right. Here's Henry Knox. What did he do? Secretary War. And back then we didn't have a standing army. No standing army. You understand what that means?
No, like we really had no defense.
But we had no professional army. When Washington marches in Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion, he calls out state militias. He leads these state militias of like 3 states, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania. The point is like there is no U.S. Army like standing around. There also isn't what other thing yet. We didn't have one at all in the war, so why would we have one after the war? No Navy. Keep in mind, today the world's greatest military is the United States, like by a mile. You understand? We're like light years ahead of everybody else in terms of both equipment, right? But also in terms of, well, I don't say we're light years above skills. I mean, the Israelis are pretty good. All right, there are some countries that got some pretty good well-trained soldiers. I'll put Navy SEALs up against anybody. Like we're the best. I think I don't say that like possible. All right, but back then they didn't even call it defense; they called it war, and so you didn't really need it unless you were going to what? Go to war, and Washington had no plan on doing that. And then this fourth one we'll add here in a minute. Now, yesterday I told you that the Bill of Rights gets created in the very first Congress. Okay? It's actually, what happens is James Madison, remember him? He read the anti-federalist positions. He read it and said, okay, I promise, we promise to fix that when I go to Congress. And so he drafts 12 articles to change the Constitution. Now, under the Constitution, to change it, you had to have what? Anybody look that up yet? You had to have 2/3 of the states propose a convention. Well, Madison was afraid of that. By the way, we've never done that. Why do we not want to do that? It's a constitutional convention, right? If we have 2/3 of the states call a constitutional convention, can they really play with the Constitution? Totally, because it's a meeting to amend the Constitution. Who knows what they're going to do, right?
Yeah.
So what he got was 2/3 of both houses of Congress, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, to submit this to the states. They were all ratified by 1792. Ratified means the states voted to pass them. He actually proposed 12 through Congress. 12 made it through Congress. Actually proposed 15. 12 made it through Congress, but only 10 were ratified. One would have set the maximum number of congressmen on a ratio that they would have determined by population. So today we would have like 900 congressmen or more. You understand?
Yeah.
And they didn't pass it, but it's still active. Like states could still pass it, but it would make the House of Representatives mammoth. In other words, it said like I forget how many people, it was 60,000 or what. It actually gave a population peg number, which it doesn't. Does anybody know what the House is pegged at currently and has been since like, I think like the 20s? Very good. 435. Excellent. 435. So don't forget that. All right. But when we look at the Bill of Rights, almost all of the first 4, well, really all of the first 4, already existed virtually everywhere. You understand? By and large. So when Madison was considering it, he considered the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Remember that thing? Lord Mason, you got to know it. English Bill of Rights, Magna Carta. All right, he looked at through the history of rights and he compiled the obvious ones. Now, the Second Amendment has had a lot of debate, but keep in mind what was not in existence in 1790 or 89. No military, right? So, what is necessary for order and stability? It actually says a well-regulated militia, right? In other words, we want you states to have militias because you don't have an army. We don't have an army. But it needs to be practiced and trained and stuff. Well, the Supreme Court has since, interestingly enough, a conservative court has since said, well, no, that extends to your right to bear arms individually, not just as a member of a what? Well-regulated militia. So that's where we are today. Probably not what they intended initially, but then again, everybody had a gun back in the day. So maybe it is what they intended. We're not absolutely sure. We know what the debate sounded like when they were passing the bill. It was a debate over militias, and there wasn't much debate over it. So nonetheless, the right to bear arms.
They had cannons back then.
Right. Yeah. Well, the individuals, people did not have cannons. So that's a good point. All right. And we really didn't have, the militia had a cannon, perhaps, or two, but not you, the person. No quartering of troops. That comes straight out of winter. Out of the revolution. Who wants to deal with that, right? But apparently that was something in their mind that would have happened more often, particularly since we didn't have like standing army that had its own barracks and stuff. If we call up an army, where might they be staying? Somebody's house. We don't want that to happen, right? 5 through 7 are all rules about court proceedings. You notice that? All of them are about court proceedings. And anybody guess why? It has the same thing to do with the year it was in 1789. No, but that had happened. So what were they afraid of? Really timely. Why make all these rules governing judicial proceedings?
So they couldn't be used.
What couldn't be used? What branch could potentially be tyrannical because it had no rules? Judicial branch. There is no rules governing the judicial branch at all, right? Like the judicial branch is basically free to interpret the Constitution, right? So they want to make sure that these judicial, by the way, how long are you appointed to the judiciary? For life, right? So they want to make sure these people didn't take this stuff away or abuse this stuff. So the courts are kind of regulated by 5, 6, and 7, and 8. I don't need you to memorize these or learn all these. You've probably heard of them before, but I wanted to familiarize yourself with them, okay? I will explain due process later when it gets to the individual states, but as far as our concern, I would like you to know that due process means that you must be treated equally under the law by the federal government. Now, do remember this. The Bill of Rights is the federal government. There was a debate in the first Congress as do these apply to the states? The answer at the time was no. You understand? So this is how Massachusetts can have an established religion into the 1790s. You understand? Because only who cannot establish a religion? Federal government. Congress shall not. Only who can deny you, cannot. Only who can guarantee your freedom of speech? Federal government. Now, of course, the expectation was, and the reality was, in many states, did they already have Bill of Rights? Did Virginia already have a guarantee of speech and religion and stuff like that? But a huge change is going to come, folks, after the Civil War. A lot of big changes are going to come after the Civil War. But one is going to come regarding due process, that part up there. Because we're going to have an addition to the Constitution called the 14th Amendment that says states must guarantee equal protection under the law and guarantee due process. So you hear that? States are free to discriminate under this. This applies only to who? The federal government. Everybody understand that? Let that sink in. Now, this applies to the states because of the 14th Amendment. But when it was created, it only applied to the national government, centralized government. Okay, so again, 5 through 8, court stuff, right? Making sure, by and large. But it's these last 2 that are the most complicated and have created the most debate. Number 9, and I misspoke yesterday. I called the 10th briefly this, and I didn't mean to. The 10th, we'll get to it in a second, but the 9th is unenumerated rights. The enumeration of certain rights. That means this list. Many people were concerned about the Bill of Rights. Why? Why would this be a concern? What's concerning about a list of rights? Well, it's supposed to not abuse them now that you have them. If I tell
They're
you,
limited.
go ahead. Go
They're
ahead.
limited. So if it's not specifically listed, then people might not be treated right.
Okay, very good. So in other words, is this all the rights we have? How do you know that? Well, of course, you know such a thing as human rights, which, by the way, they are guaranteed due process, life, liberty, and property. They're guaranteed in that. Human rights, right? Yeah, that's a classic. But what about one of my personal favorites from my government, the right to privacy? I don't want the government snooping around in my email. I don't want the government peering into my text messages, right? Into my private everyday life. But is there anywhere in here a right to privacy? No. Are your medical records guaranteed to be private? No. Yes. Yes, they are. Because who determined you have more rights than are listed here? The courts. The courts have to determine that. And this is where common law becomes a factor. Because of the Ninth Amendment, and that is where primarily this right is debated from, although they say it's a penumbral thing. This means you have a right to be free in your home from undue, right? This definitely says you have the right to be free in your home, right? So they're free in your person and home, no unreasonable search and seizure. So without a search warrant, I don't want the federal government tiptoeing into my email. Understand? And that's a Ninth Amendment guarantee. But it took the courts to determine that. And of course, there are other rights that people debate. The right for women, right, to have abortion, have access to that. That's come out of the Ninth Amendment. Okay? So the right to have your educational records private. Okay? The right to have people with disabilities have an equal education. So this all comes out of the idea that are all of your rights listed here? Now, opponents would say, well, then it's the duty of who to guarantee those rights? The state. Like if a state wants to restrict abortion, they would argue they can. Because is there anything in here in that Constitution about the government having the right to guarantee a right to abortion? It's a debate. We still have this debate, right? Ninth Amendment would say, yes, you have more rights than are what? Critics of that argument would say, well, what about the rights of the unborn? So there are debates that hinge around this. Okay, we get that. But they were concerned that, like, do I have a right to get up on the left side of bed in the morning? Do I have to start listing every right I possibly have? And that, of course, leads to a debate in our history, too, about what's a right and what's a privilege. Do you have the right to go in a public facility without wearing a mask? Government can't. The courts are weighing in on that right now. You understand? Because public safety is also a guaranteed right. Safety. So it's a dilemma of sorts. And that's why we have an independent judiciary. That's why the courts are supposed to be the resolver of this dispute. And the number 10th Amendment, and this again, going back to yesterday, definitely one of the more controversial in the next 50 years to follow. Not so controversial today, just about everybody kind of accepts the supremacy clause now. But I'm telling you, what is Montana voting on in November? Anybody know? You guys probably aren't up for your Montana local elections. Legalizing marijuana. Another state, right? Yeah, that'll be like 26 of them, I think, or something. It is decriminalized. Now, that's a different word. It means that you're not allowed to do it, but they won't arrest you. So but here's the catch. Like, how do you enforce an action that's illegal if the government's not enforcing it? Like, whose job is it? I'll give you a prime example. Whose job is it to secure illegal immigration enforcement? ICE. That's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency of what branch of government? Okay. Right, of the federal government. Therefore, it is in no way the responsibility of who to enforce immigration? The states. Yet all across the country, states that don't help ICE get called sanctuaries, right? So states say that's not what we want to spend our money on. And they're criticized for that. Or we're not going to spend our money on arresting pot dealers. The problem is it's not a uniform message, is it? This is the danger of federalism, is that if each state does whatever it wants, even if the federal government has laws, that's a problem, isn't it? If we're going to decriminalize marijuana or outlaw marijuana or legalize marijuana, whichever, then it has to be uniform. Because we're violating, the states that are legalizing marijuana are in direct violation of a federal law. You understand? I mean, we would call this nullification. They are not following a federal law. And so then becomes the question, well, whose job is it to enforce it? It's the executive agency's job to enforce it. But what we have now, and we've had for decades, are presidents who pick and choose which laws they like and which ones they don't. This is not what the founders intended. First of all, they didn't intend to have this many laws, all right? But secondly, if you're going to make a law, you better what? They would say enforce it, right? So that's the idea: is that don't make laws. That who should be making laws? The states. States should make most laws, is what the founders basically did. And as long as the feds didn't deny this, they go about their business. You understand? And that's what the anti-federalists insisted on. Like, if we're going to get behind this at all, New York, all right, Virginia, then you're going to have to guarantee some liberty, people. Got it? So I know it's complicated. We're going to do a whole lot more on this in AP government or in government, but I would definitely try to learn it. All right. So one of the key laws that is passed in the very first Congress, I think they started it on the first day of the first Congress after they swore them in and stuff. It's like, we got to do this. It's in the Constitution, is to create a Supreme Court. Now, technically, the Supreme Court is created, right, in the Constitution. But the number of justices, this is another topic that's been highly controversial lately, right? The number of justices is determined by Congress. Understand? So there's a lot of talk about President Trump and court appointments, and then the counter talk is Vice President Biden putting more justices on the court. Well, he can't do that unless the Congress adds justices. But the original Supreme Court had 6 justices, 5 are called associates, okay, and 1 chief. And you should know the Chief Justice. What was his name? John Jay. So John Jay of the Federalist Papers, okay? John Jay disliked the job so much he quit after 1 year. All right. In fact, I think 4 of the 5 quit after 1 year. They didn't do anything. Like, no, all they could do was ride circuit. So they created 13 federal districts, they call them. 2 of them in Virginia, 2 in Massachusetts, and the other states had 1 each, right? And within that, you had the federal district court and then what we call federal circuit courts. It's like the Court of Appeals, right? And then what would be the final court of appeals? The Supreme Court. That's the order of our court system. Is you begin your trial in the judicial court districts, federal district court is what they call it. And then if you have an appeal that goes forward, you win your appeal, so to speak, you go to an appellate court, which is a circuit court of appeals. They call it circuit because the justices and the judges would ride around. In other words, they didn't have a permanent circuit courthouse. They would just ride from district courthouse to district courthouse. And 2 of the justices on the Supreme Court had to do this every year. That's why they quit. They didn't like it because that meant they had to go ride around in the countryside somewhere. One of them almost froze to death in the Rappahannock. I remember reading that. His cart wrecked. So they're like, I don't like this. And no cases came to it. It also created, now they didn't call it the Justice Department yet. They'll call it that in the 1840s, but they called it the Office of the Attorney General, who was the legal advisor to the government. That's right. That's who it was. Edmund Randolph. Randolph was a signer of the Constitution. He proposed the Virginia plan, friend of Washington's, and in the courts, all justices were confirmed by the court, by the Senate, no problem. But I'll point that out. The Senate has the advise and consent clause. That means the Senate is the one that confirms appointments, be they Supreme Court nominations, like they're doing this weekend, maybe, or ambassadors or heads of cabinets. They have that responsibility. The Senate does, not the House, like the older people, so to speak. Okay, now I wanted to break apart Hamilton's plan and make it a little more clear for you. So 3 of Hamilton's plans kind of go together in a scholars would call it like this is magnum opus, this is his masterpiece. He presented this to the House of Representatives, and in it, this is a quote I took from his testimony: credit, private or public, is of greatest consequence to every country. Of this, it might be called the invigorating principle. It's the thing that gives our country life, is being able to borrow money. All right? But you can't get rich without borrowing money. Just ask President Trump. It's like some unbelievable amount of money in debt. You understand? I mean, like mammoth amount, apparently. And a lot of it's supposed to come due next term. They say that's happen while he's president. Serious issues. Nonetheless, to have money, you really have to borrow money, unless you inherit money. So you think about Jefferson, he looks really rich. Biggest wine collection in America at one point, right? When he dies, he owes so much money, his estate has to sell Monticello. this thing went into some private ownership. Can you imagine? Like some dude lived in Monticello, right? That's because he had all this debt when he died. Kind of like America, you know? So that is not unusual at all for really rich people to be fake rich. You understand? It means living on borrowed time. Well, why is Hamilton encouraging that? I told y'all this yesterday. Why does he consider a public debt a blessing and not a curse? It binds who? What class of people to the success of our country? Rich people. Rich people. You need rich people to make sure the country works, right? And it's true. You do. Okay. It also means the states will be bound more because when you assume, that's the word, right? When you assume the state's debts, it's like they took on their obligation. Kind of a relationship before, right? Now, these two, funding at par and assumption, are in the report of public credit. Funding at par, paying off the old debt, and assumption. That's the two processes. A tariff comes in actually a much larger proposal called the Report of Manufactures. The Report of Manufactures actually creates the idea of the American economic system. It is literally called the American system. It will not come to fruition under him, but it will be proposed again under a man named Henry Clay. So here's where you have Hamilton v. Jefferson. Hamilton believes the future of the United States is like England. Manufacturing, commerce, banking. Jefferson believes it's like rural France. Farming, right? Agrarian. Distant from each other. Happier, right? So cities and factories and banks, boom. Hamilton, urban guy, New Yorker, right? Albemarle County, rural farming types. Jefferson, okay? And so that's going to be your great odds. Now, we talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton didn't think that, Hamilton was surprised at this response. They're like, why would they come out and protest? You know, like, well, this is literally their livelihood. You know, they're corn producers. They're turning into corn whiskey. And you're watching them crush it. All right, and then that is the first bank of the United States. That's in Philadelphia. Okay, and this is the one that really, in many ways, creates the greatest controversy. And we talked about why the bus, as I call it, right? Bus, why it's so controversial, y'all. Why is it controversial? Everybody in this room can tell me, like, this thing right here is. Man. Folks, I do hope you're making an effort to learn the material and not simply get through the material, because that's a very different perspective. If you can't understand this, then you still don't understand the debate of our country yet. And that's okay. You get there.
The Constitution didn't say
That's
they
right.
created banks.
There's nothing in the Constitution. This thing, as far as many people are concerned, was grotesquely unconstitutional. It was the first real test of what part of the Constitution. Yeah, that's right. You can't recall it, right? Okay. The elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. I know we talked about it, right? The language of the necessary and proper clause. Where does the government have the authority to carry out its foregoing powers? It can do what is called the necessary and proper clause, right? Carrying out foregoing powers, coining money, borrowing money, collecting money, right? Well, all those things involve, you got to put it somewhere. Now, Jefferson said, sure, you can put it in state banks. They'll handle it, right? Banks that are at state level. Let them deal with it. Let the states deal with it, right? Hamilton said that's ridiculous. Because money will be frittered away, right? Got to have it where? One place, so you can issue money based on it, that is secure money. This is hard money. This is like hard banking. You know, it's not being a relaxed banker. But it means your money is going to be what? Not only safe, but good. The money you issue is backed by something. You understand? Keep in mind, what is Jefferson's debt backed by? His house, his slaves, his farmland. And so what does he have to do to pay it off? Liquidate all of that, right? Hamilton says that's bad economics. But is that a lot of what the South is based on? deeply indebted rich farmers, right? Yes, that's really what the South's based on. You know, Tiki Mac, when they bought a slave, for them, it was a long-term investment. I know that sounds horrible, but that's where almost all their capital was in people and land. So you can see why they would, and again, I don't support it, but you can see why they would argue vehemently to defend that. If you end that, then they don't have the money because there's no what in the South. No factories, all right? There's no businesses, you know, there's nothing like that. And so Northerners own businesses and operated, you know, employees and stuff like that. So really a big difference emerging from the beginning, right? So the way that they understand reality filters the way they understand the Constitution, isn't it? Because it's really convenient. Jefferson would say, oh, you can't do that. He did not like big bankers, okay? Because of course he owed money to them. All right. So Hamilton, though, making a very articulate argument, very skillful argument, said, look, it is not denied, therefore it is what? Implied. That's why we call this the doctrine, you might write this down beside the bus, the doctrine of implied powers. It comes from the elastic laws. Now, I told you guys yesterday, in a case called U.S. v. Lopez, the federal government overreached when it created a gun-free school zone law, right? Because there's nothing in these foregoing powers, these 17, that says you can't carry a firearm to school. So who gets to tell you that? Well, your school can, your local government, but who else does in Virginia? The state does. Is that well within the power of the 10th Amendment? Yes. And for public safety, that limitation on the Second Amendment has been upheld in schools, all right? But you guys can also carry firearms at your house. Now, Virginia's got a law that's going to be challenged about the age in which firearms can be owned by teenagers. Okay, unaccompanied. But
Yeah, no one listens to that law.
right, it's one of those laws that's going to get, I think, going to be struck down ultimately because of precedent. But nonetheless, you know, there are lots of laws that are out there right now that are gun laws, but they're from Virginia. They're not from where. So he's saying, I'm not basing the bus on the reserve powers, right? I have to do this in order to do what? In order to do what? This is like the hub to make all this work, right? And I can't collect taxes and then send them out to the states or just put them in a box somewhere, right? Yeah, I gotta have a place to put it. So this will be a major debate. Implied powers, okay? So implied powers come from what part of the Constitution? Two names. Names, like not descriptor. What's the clause?
Elastic.
Elastic. That's the informal name of it. Or necessary and proper clause. It is necessary and proper to make a bank. Now, can any of you guys guess how this debate's going to get resolved?
James Madison and Hamilton go to dinner.
No, not that part. Yeah, not that debate. But you're right. The dinner conversation. No, the state of Maryland in 1819 is going to sue. Well, let me back that up. The state of Maryland in 1819 is going to tax the branch of the Bank of the United States in Maryland. It's going to put taxes on them. All right, state taxing plus. It's going to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to say two things. John Marshall, he's going to say the power to tax is the power to destroy. Who has the power to tax? Federal government. Secondly, regarding that, a state cannot tax a what? A nation. Well, a federal entity, a national agency. So Maryland cannot tax this thing because who created this thing? USA, federal government. That's called the doctrine of supremacy. Remember the supremacy clause? And then he says, oh, but by the way, this thing is constitutional. Because of what clause? The elastic clause, right? So eventually Hamilton's colleague, John Marshall, is going to say, yes, it's constitutional as a federalist. All right, you understand? I've said for years, if people want to get rid of something, I don't care what it is, abortion, whatever, stop trying to ban it. Banning is not a way of America. It doesn't work. Prohibition didn't work, right? Tax the living daylights out of whatever it is. I don't think that's a good thing personally, but is that well within the power of the federal government to tax? In fact, that's what Chief Justice John Roberts said made Affordable Care Act legal. Because if you don't get health care, you have to pay a fine, right? Well, he said paying a fine is a version of a tax. Thus, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is constitutional under what clause? Taxing clause. I know it's a lot to process, all these moving parts, right? But this document is still the governing document in America 230 years later, right? So that's pretty amazing. And we're still having a pretty heated debate over what thing? Doctrine of implied powers. Still having this debate, right? So that's the brilliance of the elastic nature of the Constitution, is that it's an interpretive document, 240 years, 50 years that we wrote the thing, 230. All right, so here is something we put up yesterday. Keep in mind, this is a philosophic view about these two men, but it's really not just them. It's more like their supporters. It is these two fellas that will create the foundation of the two-party system in America. And we are still having that argument to this day between their two central arguments. All right, so Hamilton, what is his nature? His nature is conservative. All right, because man is inherently bad. You know, you have to have law and order. You have to have smart people running the society. Okay, Jefferson, the most freedom, the most happiness. That's liberalism. Although both of these are more of the classic variety. The modern variety of conservatism would be embodied by somebody like Ronald Reagan. Not Donald Trump. Donald Trump very much a populist. All right, there are elements of him that are conservative, but he's what we would call a populist in that trend. All right. The modern liberal is very much the product of Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt. So you sort of have still conservatives and liberals, but they don't quite jive up with Hamilton and Jefferson. Okay, so if you take someone like Barack Obama, whose critics would call him a liberal, very moderate centrist compared to anybody from the 60s. You understand? So what's happened is that because of the success of Ronald Reagan, the political center in America shifted to the right. Okay, so a centrist now would be conservative. Ronald Reagan, though, ironically, might not even get elected these days because the right is so much further to the right than where it used to be. So that's just the nature of politics. It's a pendulum, it swings. But it's pretty much still who's who. More government, that's the irony, is today the liberal is more government, all right, and the conservative is less government. But this is probably more like classic conservative and libertarian, all right? But we're still arguing sort of about their views of the Constitution. All right, one is strict. So if you think of like Antonin Scalia, an originalist. If you think of Justice Kavanaugh, originalist. If it's not in there, then it's reserved to who? Okay, people through their what? Through the state, right? All right, exceeded the authority. If there are going to be any like governmental created banks, who must do it? States, right? Not USA. So if you're strict, you find your home base in the 10th Amendment. Reserve powers. All right. If you're loose, you go where? What do you like if you're loose? Elastic, right? Necessary, proper. And you're more commercial and manufacturing. So make sure you understand this is how voting is going to start to take place. These are like the two camps of voters in America. Jefferson's party will end up becoming this complicated name, the Democrat Republicans. Thanks a lot, right? You know, they're called the DRs, the Democratic Republicans. They'll later drop the R off and they'll just be the Democrats. Okay? But frequently, and I do want to warn you, frequently in the 1790s and early 1800s, they'll use the word Republican interchangeably. You ever hear that? So if you ever see the word Republican and it's before 1800, that's a Democrat Republic. The actual Republican Party emerges in 1856. Okay, and elects Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So that's 60 years later. All right, so DRs, Democrats, and occasionally they call them Republicans. What are Hamilton's friends called? The Federalists. Yeah, they're called the Federalist Party. That's their name, you know, the Federalist Party. So the DRs are what group of people from the Constitutional Convention? Anti-Federalists, right. So the Anti-Federalist Party becomes known as the Democrat Republicans. Later, the Democrats. Okay. But the 20th century is going to see an alignment shift of the political philosophy of the parties. Keep in mind, the Democrats were the party of the South. and the Confederacy. All right. But in the 20th century, they're going to become the party of the North and Franklin Roosevelt. Right. So I'll explain that when we get to Teddy Roosevelt era. Okay. But that switch will ultimately happen. So today, when you think about the modern Democratic Party, you associate it more with liberalism and like Northern influence, I guess you say. Although we've had historically strong Southern Democrats over the years too. Okay, so here's your election, which I explained. You now have a new party. What are they called? Federalist. Well, all right. So Washington is nominated as a Federalist, but keep this in mind. Does Washington ever himself call himself a Federalist? There's nothing about Washington. In fact, Washington utterly condemns political parties. One of the greatest things about it. All right. You know, he says, I have no use for those things. All right. Madison predicted political parties in Federalist 10. He said they're going to happen, and they're going to be happening most often over the sources of money. He was right. You know, Madison's a smart dude too. But Washington kind of was above it all. And so in 92, what does he do? Every single elector votes for him again. All right. So he's reelected unanimously. Again, only time that's happened, right? Again, who is elected vice president? John Adams. So 2 for 2, right? But you start to notice some factionalization. Faction is their word for party, right? Technically, Jefferson makes no effort to have any nomination at all. Like he didn't. Clinton, by the way, is from the most powerful family in New York. They're not in any way connected to like Senator Clinton or Governor Clinton or President Clinton. You know, but these are the Clintons of New York. This guy's he was governor of New York, but this guy's either son or nephew or cousin, I forget right now, will build the Erie Canal. DeWitt Clinton. So the Clintons are a very powerful family in New York. Got it? But Washington gets reelected, obviously, and you can see that there are a few names that are on here. One in particular that's going to show that he has some support in New York. His name appears for the first time. Aaron Burr, right? For my Hamilton fans. Okay. So yeah, that's what unanimous looks like, right? Okay. So I want to go to here, and then we'll stop today. So I mentioned earlier, foreign problems are in many ways going to most dominate our earliest presidencies, primarily because they don't have much domestic policy. Like when we think about tax cuts, or we think about border security, or we weren't talking about that stuff yet. So Hamilton has done his economic thing, right? The 5-step program. And now you have the French Revolution debate. So keep in mind that Washington, above all else, wants to avoid getting in any way entangled in this. You understand? Washington actually makes a prediction. He says it will take us a generation, about 20 years, before we're able to fight a major war. It says that about 1792. Anybody know what happens in 20 years? War of 1812. Right. So like George Washington, not a scholar, but man, this guy gets it right time and time again when it comes to like real policy. All right. So he's like, we can't get involved in a war. It's not our best interest. The problem is, what do we want to do with Britain and France? What do we need to do, Hamilton says? Because Britain.
Stop letting them bully us.
Well, we need to have commerce with them. Great nations have to trade. So we need to trade, particularly Britain, workshop of the world, right? And we need to be able to borrow money and start building our own factories. And in many ways, Hamilton envisions a country rising up, sort of an urban/rural society that becomes self-dependent, all dependent on itself, independent. But we're not there yet, so we need resources. Plus, what is starting to happen in France? Well, initially, we are sympathetic. In fact, I told you guys earlier, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is the French Declaration of Independence, is co-authored by Thomas Jefferson in his parliament. So he is very much a part of the earliest days of the French Revolution. He's good friends with the Marquis de Lafayette, who's returned to France and is now talking about this, okay? This idea of revolution. Keep in mind, the first phase of the French Revolution is called bourgeois, which means like middle-class revolution, right? They're not killing the monarch in the first phase. So initially, how do we feel? We're like, yeah, overthrow a monarchy and create a constitutional monarchy based on the Enlightenment and inspired by us. Liberté, viva, you know, like, let's do that. And then what do? 1793. They execute Louis, they execute Marie, and then they execute another 60,000 people, right? And so this becomes known as the Reign of Terror, remember? And it's the Reign of Terror where really even ordinary Americans who were pro-French are like, no, they can all too far. It starts even before. You had something called the Great Fear, which spread through the French countryside where they burned estates. That made conservative people in America nervous, right? But then they had a group in Paris that slaughtered the royalists called the Buveurs de Sang, the guys who drink blood, right? So what was happening, and then they outlawed Christianity. So it's like they went off the rails, right? And Jefferson was very much a Francophile. He loved France, and when he was in France, he loved it. Okay, he loved their spirit, he liked their countryside, their liberty, their idea of pure liberty, as he considered it, not corrupted. And so they started out forming like pro-French organizations directly against Washington's directives. He's like, don't pick sides in this. We are going to be what? And they do start to do this. Meanwhile, the Federalists, Adams, Hamilton particularly, view the English as much more stable. Keep in mind how the English got their rights over the history of English rights. Occasional rebellion, but more often evolutionary, right? Like more, you know, particularly the Glorious Revolution. That's the one they most look at, like where James II is ousted without killing anybody, you know, like peaceful transfer of power, right? Then the French, and now keep in mind, this is the French Republic. This is dead monarch French. Send, by the way, they all their people adopt a single title, citizen. So everybody's equal. There is no monsieur and madame and all that. It's a citizen. So their ambassador to America is named as Citizen Genet. Got it up there, Edward Genet. Whoops. He arrives in America in actually in like Georgia and starts moving up, like rallying people to fight Spanish Florida. Because Spain is kind of, you know, an enemy of the Republic. An enemy of everybody in Europe is an enemy of France at the time, right? And so Genet is actually recruiting Americans to fight against British and Spanish people. Got it? He's the ambassador from France. Washington brings Genet to Philadelphia. And he says, you must cease doing this. You know, you must stop like trying to get French people, Americans to help you. Genet's like, I will go over your head to the American people. But basically, Genet like tries to talk smack to George Washington. So what does Washington do? He kicks him out of the country. He's like, you're exiled. Get out of here. All right. But clearly, is this a problem? By the way, who was Secretary of State right when that happened? Thomas Jefferson, pro-France Thomas Jefferson, right? By the way, he quits after that. And Edmund Randolph becomes Secretary of State. And so at that point, it looks like we're going to break into war. And Washington makes his first formal foreign policy statement, and it is very powerful. It is called the Neutrality Proclamation. So you definitely need to know that. This is Washington's response to the French, because the French are saying, hey, wait a minute, we have a treaty with you. We have a treaty with you, right? Do we have a treaty with France? We signed a treaty with France to fight who? Britain in the American Revolution. Hamilton points out to Genet, dude, that treaty was with who? With Louis XVI, who you killed. All right, so that kind of nullified that treaty. But Washington doesn't go under that realm. He doesn't debate that. All right, he says simply, it is not our conduct to take sides. We are going to be what? Friendly and impartial. We are going to avoid all acts. Now, he's criticized by this by the Republicans, the DRs. All right? But he wants the people to understand the role of the United States. And if you go back and study George Washington, I do believe George Washington imagines America as like Switzerland. You understand? Like, he does not want to take sides in conflicts, period. If they're not in whose interest? Their own. Our interest. So here's the great debate between Washington, the realist, and Jefferson, the philosopher. Jefferson believes that it is in our interest to support France for the idea of revolution and liberty. In other words, should we support other countries rebelling against their governments to create democracy? Washington says, no, that is not in our interest. All right, he says, that is not our problem. And so here we have the very foundation of American isolationism, which is a hallmark of America until World War II. You understand? Until the second half of the 20th century, America is going to look at this and basically say, we're not going to get involved in what? foreign disputes. We'll be friendly and impartial. Well, that's it. We're not taking sides. So I think Washington, of all of our presidents, was the one that was most grounded in realism. You understand what I mean by that? Not influenced by philosophical objectives. You understand? And it's okay to have that debate. We're going to have some of the most idealistic presidents in history before we're here. All right? If you think about Thomas Jefferson, he's one of the greatest ideologues of all time, idealists and philosophers, right? Woodrow Wilson. We're going to fight a war to end all war, right? Remember? Make the world safe for democracy. But Washington's like, that's not what war's about. It's not why wars are fought. Wars are fought for our interests. And should only be for that. You understand? So he has a very strong statement saying that we're going to be impartial. All right? We're not going to violate other countries' rights, but we're not going to be a part of it. So that's where I'm going to stop you with Washington today. And we'll finish him. I'm not going to teach tomorrow much. It's our home day. In fact, I'm not going to teach at all. You guys are going to take your test. So I'll unlock the test in the morning, and you have the day to work on it, okay, or get it sent in. All right? And we'll be finishing up with, I think, this chapter on Thursday. Any questions from the folks at home?
How far do we need on the reading tonight?
Well, we're going to, if I were you, and I know you guys are having a hard time I know you're having a hard time like studying and being students away from